everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is October the 19th, 2023. I'm Barry Stagner. Very glad to have you joining with us this evening. And boy, what a week and what a world we're living in. Just incredible things happening in the realm of Bible prophecy. And it is just an amazing time to be alive. You know, one of the things I think we always need to keep in mind is how fortunate we are to have the information that we have. And this is why I think we can take heart in the fact that we need not be afraid, even as we watch things unfold that are tragic and traumatic and kind of hard on our emotions and mind. And yet we know the end of the story. And I think one of the things that is being ignored by many today, I don't know if you caught my little clip that I did yesterday, just in light of the fact that there are so many things being said out there that are just flat out inaccurate. And we have to remember that the Jews are back in their national homeland because God's name was being profaned every day they were outside of the land that he gave them. And we found this from Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 20 and on. And we need to remember that God is in the center of this. And really what we're seeing is a battle of good and evil. And as the world is being polarized and divided, even as Zechariah 12:3 said was going to happen in the last days. And we are watching Jerusalem becoming a burdensome stone to all nations. And the world is being prepared for a guy to come along and say, I've got a plan. We'll solve this Middle East crisis. We'll let the Jews rebuild their temple and we'll get things going in a peaceful manner moving forward from this point forward. And the main catalyst for him being allowed to rise to power is the church's removal. And so we should be expecting any day now the trumpet to sound and for the dead in Christ to rise and we who are alive and remain to be caught up, harpazo, raptured together to meet the Lord in the air. You know, somebody made mention, a comment on my video yesterday that, the rapture is pre-wrath. And I would agree with that with this caveat. We have to understand that the whole tribulation is wrath. The removal of the church is an act of God's wrath that leaves the world without a purifying and preserving influence in the ministry of the Holy Spirit being manifested through the church. Now, I will say we have to remember that the Holy Spirit is not going to be removed from the world. He is God, and therefore he is omnipresent. And these things are going to go back to the way they were in Old Testament times, where the Spirit will come upon people. And yet the one group in all of human history that has the exclusive blessing of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit is going to be taken out of the way so the lawless one could be revealed. And he cannot be revealed until that hindering influence of the Holy Spirit through the church is removed from the world scene. So, yeah, as far as pre-wrath goes, I would agree with that, with the caveat that I would say that the whole thing is wrath, because that's what the Bible indicates, that the whole of the tribulation period is God's wrath. It starts with the consequential wrath of God, man receiving what he has sown and reaping what he has sown, and then the cataclysmic wrath of God begins within the opening of the four seals. So again, just a reminder that we should be looking up, for our redemption is nigh. And it can't be the blessed hope if we're going to go through the tribulation and many of us not even survive. But, if we look at what happens during the tribulation, and we have to remember we don't have an appointment with any of it. And the whole of it is the 70th week of Daniel. And the church wasn't here for the first 69 weeks. So the church won't be here for the 70th either. We will be taken out of the way in a moment and a twinkling of an eye. Now, let's move on with our stories here this evening. And we've got some doozies, and things are heating up, to say the least. The Associated Press reports that Israel's defense minister tells troops to be ready for the ground invasion of Gaza. Now, we've been hearing this talk over the last few days. Be ready, be ready. And Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told Israeli infantry soldiers on Thursday on the Gaza border to be ready, and this is according to the AP. He urged the ground troops to get organized, be ready for an order to move in. Whoever sees Gaza from afar now will see it from the inside, Gallant said, I promise you. It might take a week, a month, 2 months until we destroy them, he added, referring to Hamas. Israel's consent for Egypt to let food and water in, as well as medicine, provided the first possibility for an opening in its sealing off of the territory. And Israel did not list fuel as a permitted item, but a senior Egyptian security official said Egypt was negotiating for the entry of fuel for hospitals. And the official spoke on the condition of anonymity because he was not authorized to talk to the press. The first trucks of aid were expected to go in Friday, Egypt's state-owned Al Qahira News reported. Now, again, we have to remember that this is a battle against Hamas. And, a lot of people try and draw a distinction between the people of Gaza and Hamas. But we also need to remember that, most of the Palestinians are bent on the destruction of the Jews. And they've, by a 60% vote, elected Hamas. Now, that could have been largely coerced. But, we do not want to forget that there are Christians in the Palestinian territories. And we also need to remember that, as I said at the outset, this is God's land. He said the day that the people, every day that the people were out of his land, his name is profane. So he brought his people back to his land. And Amos 9:15 says they will never be uprooted again. So again, this battle is against the violence of Hamas. And interesting that Hamas is the Hebrew word for violence. And as Gallant said, they are bent on the elimination of Hamas so that, decent Palestinian people can live without the threat of all the things that Hamas has been doing, and with the benefit of the billions and billions of dollars of aid that have been sent to 2.3 million people. I don't know what the total figure is over the years, but there have been billions of dollars that have been sent into this area. And, yet people are living in poverty, third world type situations, while the leaders of Hamas live outside the country in luxury and live like kings. And so that tells us, at least in part, where some of the money is going. Now, I've mentioned multiple times that the word Palestinian or Palestine is a Latinized form of the word Philistine. Philistines were from the Greek islands. They are not Arab. The modern day Palestinians, so to speak, are Arabs. As a matter of fact, most Muslim scholars and clerics would tell you that the Palestinians are actually Syrian Arabs. And this is true. And, excuse me, there is absolutely no historical right to the land whatsoever. There's been a Jewish presence in Israel for 3,500 years. Jerusalem has been the capital of Israel. There's archaeological evidence and historical evidence, to say nothing of the content of the Bible that dates all the way back to 1200 BC of an Israeli presence in the area now once known as Canaan, now known as the land of Israel. So again, of course, everyone is concerned about the loss of life, and we should be concerned about the promised land. And we have to remember that God is going to rise up someday when all the nations of the world are gathered against Israel. He is, as Zechariah the prophet says, he's going to fight as he fights in the day of battle. So we do know the end game, and sadly, there's a loss of life. And, none of this would have happened had Hamas not decided we're just going to try and kill as many Jews. And my friend Amir Sarfati had reported that they brought across the border enough weaponry to kill 10,000 people. And they were thwarted in their attacks finally when the IDF and others showed up and police departments began to fight back. But their intention or capacity for death was to kill 10,000 Jews. And of course, we know that this hatred goes a long way back. It goes all the way to Ishmael and Isaac, and this predicted animosity between the two continues to this very day. Now, Reuters says that Iran delivers an ominous warning after Gaza hospital explosion. A top Iranian official claimed, "Time is up." Iranian officials sent several unspecified warnings following an explosion at a hospital in Gaza on Tuesday that reportedly caused numerous casualties amid the Israel-Hamas conflict. Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdullani, wrote on social media that the time is running out for Israel after the explosion. which Hamas and Palestinian officials blamed on the Israeli Defense Forces, while Israeli officials said it was a misfired rocket launch by a Palestinian group that caused the blast. After the terrible crime of the Zionist regime and the bombing and massacre of more than 1,000 innocent women and children in the hospital, the time has come for global unity of humanity against this fake regime, more hated than ISIS and its killing machine, Abdullanian wrote on X. He added, time is over. Meanwhile, the Iranian embassy in Syria wrote a similar message saying, time is up. Reiterating his comment in an interview with state-run media, the foreign minister said that time is running out very fast, and he said that other multiple fronts will open, and this is inevitable, according to the New York Times and other media reports. Israel reported and showed video to support it that the hospital explosion was a result of the Islamic Jihad, which, like Hamas, is a U.S.-designated terrorist group based in Gaza. And Jerusalem has denied it was behind the explosion, and the Hamas-controlled Palestinian Ministry of Health claimed the blast left hundreds of people dead, although the figure could not be independently confirmed. We do know that the missile, or the rocket, I should say, actually landed in the parking lot. And there are some who've said there actually weren't any casualties, and I haven't seen that confirmed by any official news outlet yet. We do know that the video footage that Israel has shown and that Russia demanded showed that the rocket actually originated in Gaza, and that's where it landed too. Last night, too many jumped to conclusions around the tragic loss of life at the Al-Ahi hospital. Britain's Foreign Secretary James cleverly posted on X, getting this wrong would put even more lives at risk. Wait for the facts, report them clearly and accurately. Cool heads must prevail, he concluded. And, this is having the effect that we talked about even last week in dividing and polarizing the world. And we mentioned at the outset of this program. And we need to recognize that this is exactly what the Bible said is going to happen. Now, it's interesting that if we think back to the fact that the Bible talks about invading nations coming in to Israel from the northern border, and, for any thinking person, I think to consider how in the world are these nations that are named in the Ezekiel war scenario going to wind up on the northern border of Israel? And yet, here we see under the banner, or the guise rather, of destroying ISIS, that now there's a Turkish military presence who are named in the Ezekiel war scenario. There's an Iranian military presence, again, for the destruction of ISIS was the justification for their presence there. And then Russian troops who came under that same banner. We're here to destroy ISIS. Well, they're still there. And soon we would expect there to be a hook in the jaw and draw them down out of the north. And here, this little bitty city, some 70 miles overall, is the focus of world attention. This little tiny country, 8,800 square miles, 70 square miles being its capital, the city of Jerusalem. And yet the whole world is talking about Israel, just like the Bible predicted. Now, Reuters says the U.S. State Department sent out a worldwide caution alert to Americans. The U.S. State Department on Thursday issued a worldwide alert to Americans overseas due to the potential for terrorist attacks coming in the midst of the heightened tensions in the Middle East due to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Due to increased tensions in various locations around the world, the potential for terrorist attacks, demonstrations, or violent actions against U.S. citizens and interests, the Department of State advises U.S. citizens overseas to exercise increased caution, the alert said. It then advised U.S. citizens to remain alert in locations frequented by tourists, enroll in the agency's travel program, and follow the agency on social media to receive alerts and updates. Other details were not provided, and the issuance of a rare worldwide alert bulletin comes amid demonstrations and riots across the Middle East in response to the conflict in Israel. Many demonstrators this week have targeted U.S. embassies and other compounds. And also this week, the State Department raised the travel alert for both Israel and nearby Lebanon to level 4, or its highest level. The U.S. Embassy in Beirut also allowed non-emergency personnel and family members to depart Lebanon and Israel. And the embassy in Beirut, meanwhile, urged U.S. citizens to leave as soon as possible, while commercial flights and other options are still available. The embassies for France, Canada, Australia, Germany, Sweden, and the UK have issued similar bulletins, according to reports. Now, this is one of the things I think we need to take note of concerning the last days scenario that Jesus framed for us very well in the Olivet Discourse and what we ought to look for. And one of the things we need to keep in mind is when Jesus talked about there being wars and rumors of wars, ethnic tensions, all the other issues that are named there, pestilence, plagues, if you will, and the other famine and all the other things that he named there in the Olivet Discourse, we have to remember for those who make the argument that, well, we've always had those things. There's always been ethnic tensions. There's always been wars and rumors of wars. Sometimes one has caused the other. And there's always been famine. There's always been earthquakes. But the point is that Jesus was answering a specific question about when he's coming back, signs concerning when he's coming back. He was asked by Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the two pairs of fishermen brothers amongst the 12 disciples. And they asked him specifically about the signs of his coming. So, to say that these things are just a normal course of life event and have nothing to do with the last days is outside of that whole conversation. Jesus was answering a question about what to look for when he comes. And then he closed that section with the mention of these being the beginning of sorrows, which is a phrase that can be translated from Revelation 24:8 as the commencement of birth pangs. And this is what we're seeing. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that these normal things that have happened throughout the course of human history are suddenly, like birth pangs, going to begin to intensify and increase in their frequency. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And, we just came through an administration where we had 4 years of peace and there were no wars, fighting in major wars, that is, fighting in different parts or being fought in different parts of the world. And now all of a sudden we have this exponential increase in frequency and intensity excuse me, of these things that have been a normal course of life set of events. So let's not downplay this and recognize, one of these ebb and flow movements of the prophetic clock is going to be the final one. And I believe with Israel being 75 years old, and we could very well be moving toward that moment and twinkling of an eye experience that we're all hoping and waiting for. Now, Breitbart says, reporting from PBS, that Israeli forces found Iranian-made mortars that show Iran is directly supplying weaponry to Hamas in this fight. On Monday's PBS NewsHour, PBS special correspondent Layla Molana Allen reported that Israeli soldiers located Iranian-made mortar rounds in villages that were attacked by Hamas terrorists, and that these are the first material evidence that Iran is directly supplying weaponry to Hamas in this fight, Molana Allen stated. And having beaten back hundreds of Hamas fighters after a long, brutal fight on the border with Gaza as Israeli soldiers carried out the grim job of clearing victims' homes, they found a new source of terror. In the villages that were attacked by Hamas on Saturday, the IDF found a huge cache of weaponry, thousands of pieces, and they suspect that Hamas planned a much longer fight. And scattered amidst the carnage, hand grenades, anti-tank mines, artillery rounds, North Korean manufactured rocket-propelled grenades, improvised rocket launchers, and vitally, Iranian-made mortar rounds, the first material evidence that Iran is directly supplying weaponry to Hamas in this fight. She then played a clip of an IDF soldier saying, "This is made in Iran, no doubt about it. We knew they had those. We knew they had mortars, but these Iranian mortars, this is the first time that we've seen it in this battle." Now, again, remember, Persia, or the Iranians, are named in the Ezekiel war scenario. And I believe it is entirely possible that with the polarizing of the world and with the opportunistic attitude of Russia and others, we need to keep in mind that, these countries that are named in the Ezekiel war scenario all share one common feature. Now, 4 of the 5 that are named specifically are radical Islamic countries. Now, the 5th makes a common feature among them that they are all petroleum or energy-related product-producing nations. And therefore, for Israel to encroach upon the market share, if you will, of Russia and other countries in the natural gas product market, is something that's not acceptable and very poorly timed in the midst of all the economic strains that the world is going through, including Russia, with the financial drain that they're experiencing with the Ukraine war. So, again, it is very possible that we could be seeing the precursors to the Ezekiel war scenario. Now, I said it in the past, it bears repeating today, that I personally believe that with the content of Ezekiel 39 specifically, and seeing the divine response to the invasion of Israel, and that being in the power and manifestations of God's might, flooding rain and hail and blood and an earthquake, all these things. This is the way God responds when he's going on the offensive. And this is something that is limited to the 70th week of Daniel. So I believe that the Ezekiel war could start, the rapture could happen sometime after, and then the war will end sometime during early in the tribulation, or possibly even be what causes the Antichrist to be able to take over the world and deceive the nations into following after him, coming up with a plan saying, hey, you know what? We just saw a cataclysmic event against Israel. Why don't we let them build their temple and then let's all get along? And there'll be a season of pseudo peace. And then that's going to break when the rider on the second horse of Revelation, chapter 6, rides onto the world scene and takes peace from the earth. Now, Al Arabiya says the Hamas-Israel war is a ticking time bomb, and that's an Arabic paper, obviously the English version. And the article says the sweeping impact of the conflict extends far beyond geopolitics and economics. Our people are caught in the crossfire. On October 7th, the Palestinian militant group Hamas executed an unprecedented attack on Israel, with its fighters infiltrating communities near the Gaza Strip. And the brazen assault resulted in the killing of at least 1,400 Israelis and the abduction of almost 200, marking one of the most extensive attacks on the country in decades. The conflict now stands on the precipice of extending its reach across the Middle East. With Israel's army gearing up for a potential ground invasion of Gaza, the ominous rumblings of a broader regional conflict reverberate with far-reaching consequences, and the implications extend well beyond Israel and the Palestinian territories, posing a threat to the stability of countries such as Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. And geopolitical experts in the Middle East believe the Israel-Hamas war is entering a more destructive phase, and the outcome remains uncertain. The conflict is marked by deep-rooted historical and political tensions, making it challenging to predict how and when it will end. Now, the interesting thing, I think, that this article just mentioned is it mentioned Egypt. And we have to remember, in the previous battles against Israel, including the one that broke out on the night that David Ben-Gurion declared Israel was a state, was led by Egypt. We know Egypt was involved in 67 and 73 in the Six-Day and Yom Kippur Wars. And yet here they are now kind of being a voice in this. But the interesting part about this is that the prophet Isaiah said that during the millennium that Assyria, ancient enemy of Israel, Egypt, the first to bind Israel into slavery for over 400 years and leading the charge against modern day Israel, are all going to be one. Isaiah 29 talks about this. And they will share a common language during the millennial reign of Christ on earth. So here, now we've got one of the main aggressors throughout Israel's modern history, Egypt, on the sidelines, so to speak, and definitely playing a part in all this. But they are not going to be fighting against Israel in the Ezekiel war invasion. So, and I share that with you for this reason. The Bible is always right. Whatever it says is exactly what's going to happen. And one thing I think we have to remember about is that prophecy is it's not predictions. They're not possible happenings in the future. They are history stated in advance. God has seen these things beforehand. Remember, he sits outside of time. And that's what Peter meant in 2 Peter 3:9 when he talks about a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is a day. He's just saying, time is irrelevant to God because he's outside of time. So he can see yesterday, today, and tomorrow with equal clarity. So he has told us what's going to happen in the last days. And these things are as sure as anything that can be sure. as well as all the other Bible prophecies that have yet to be fulfilled, these nations are going to invade Israel from the north. God is going to fight against them. They will lay dead on the mountains of Israel. It will take 7 months to bury the dead. They will burn the weapons for 7 years. All these things are going to happen because God has already foreseen it. He's been there, so to speak. And so he's telling us what to be watching out for. And that's one of the things I think that's interesting about the Olivet Discourse. Jesus said, no one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only. And then right after he made that statement, he said, but as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. People are buying and selling, marrying and giving in marriage, and this presents a picture of an indifference to impending signs of judgment and just going on about their business and didn't know what was coming until the day that Noah entered the ark. And we are living in those kinds of times right now. And, instead of recognizing that everything that was mentioned about Israel after God brings them back into their natural homeland that he calls his land is happening with this country. And rather than citing or recognizing Israel's right to the land, there are our own Capitol building was overrun here over the past couple of days with Hamas supporters. And one of the interesting things that I just couldn't believe that I saw in the center of this room, I think it was in the rotunda, and in the center of this room with all those who were chanting on behalf of Hamas was a handful of Orthodox Jews wearing kippahs and prayer shawls, rooting for Hamas, so to speak. And, it's just, we are so fortunate to have the Word of God. We are so blessed to know all the things that are coming upon this world and to know a God who sees tomorrow and has told us what it's all about. So we don't fall under the spirit of fear, nor follow after the delusion that is taking place in this world. Now, the Jewish News Syndicate reports that Russia will exploit Gaza war to derail Saudi peace. And Riyadh and Jerusalem normalization would pose a serious challenge to the interests of Russia, Iran, and China in the region, a professor said. Israeli relations with Russia are often described as walking a tightrope. And while Israel is aligned with the West, it is sufficiently independent to sometimes break with international consensus and engage Moscow. An estimated 150,000 Jews live in Russia, while roughly 1 million Russians and their descendants live in Israel, forming a unique cultural bridge. But on the other hand, Moscow has considerable weight to throw around. For years, Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes in Syria against Iran and its proxies, and Jerusalem and Moscow have a security coordination arrangement to prevent their forces from firing on each other. But the war in Ukraine has strained this. And while there's no evidence directly implicating Russia in Hamas' surprise assault on Israeli communities near the Gaza Strip, analysts say that Moscow will try to exploit the Gaza war to distract the world from its war in Ukraine and spoil Israel-Saudi Arabia peace efforts. There is no validated evidence for direct involvement, but there are several reasons to suspect at least Russia's imprint or its part in the chain of events leading to the attack, said Joseph Rosen, a geopolitical strategist and contributing writer to the Jerusalem-based Mizgab, the Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. We talked about this, I believe, last week when this whole thing was still unraveling, that, it was just months ago, quite literally months ago, that we saw, the efforts of the Palestinians manifested in the form of flying kites with balloons filled with fuel, gasoline, to drop with an igniter on Israeli forests and farmlands and seeking to destroy them. And now all of a sudden, in the span of that same period of months, we now see them have the technological capability to fly bomb-dropping drones into Israeli territory. And as many have reported, there's only two countries with this technology, and one is Russia and the other is the United States. So, I don't know that I necessarily fall into no credible evidence. It seems like pretty strong evidence to me of Russia involvement. And, we have to remember that, this nation is going to invade Israel, and it seems as though they're even going to lead the charge. So, again, watching all these things develop should remind us to look up because our redemption is nigh. But let me pause for a moment and just remind you, as I often do, the most important part about having the information that we have is not just so we can rejoice that we're going to escape God's wrath, because his wrath was satisfied on our behalf on the cross of Christ. But we ought to use this information that we have and the urgency of and lateness of the hour to have a burden for those who are lost and perishing around us. Jesus likened the coming of the Son of Man to the days of Noah, and I've shared this before. And in the Ark Project that Ken Ham so beautifully put together in Answers in Genesis, built a replica of the Ark according to its dimensions in the Bible. And one of the placards that I ran across in there was something I always was curious about, and that is how many people were on the earth when the flood hit. And, Ken Ham put together a group of mathematicians and geneticists, and they calculated, because of the near genetic perfection and therefore the reproductive rate of women and being much higher at that time, coupled with the lifespan of people prior to the flood, living for hundreds of years, they've estimated that there was some 16.9 billion people on the earth at the time of the flood. And I've heard numbers as high as 50 billion, but I think I would stick with the calculations of those who took into consideration those factors. But excuse me again. But again, recognizing the number of people that got on the boat, Jesus said it's going to be like that in the last days. Now, he's not saying that only 8 people are going to be taken in the rapture. He's saying that the comparison of the unbelievers versus believers is going to be rather stark, and just like we see with the days of Noah. And so, there's going to be billions of people left behind after the rapture. And I hope and pray that, there's a billion people or more taken in the rapture, but that would be a pretty strong percentage of the global world population. So, one thing we have to remember, we are seeing these things happen around us to give us a sense of urgency for the massive number of people who are not ready and need Christ. And, even as we see within the church, a split over, which side to support. Should we support Israel or should we support Hamas and the Palestinians? And, well, of course we should support Israel. God brought them back because his holy name was being profaned, and they have every right to be in the land. And there's no Palestinian historical right or association with the land. And I think we just need to recognize that and state the facts as truth. And we also need to remember that, because many, many people are siding with, the Palestinians and their cause and the occupying forces and the apartheid state of Israel and all these other things that we hear, we need to remember that we are living around millions and billions of people who are going to go into the tribulation. And therefore, we need to be telling them what's coming, telling them about what lie in the future. So when somebody says, you have to take a mark on your hand or forehead in order to buy and sell, and we've already told them that, and that the one who demands this is the Antichrist, and that if you take that mark, that you have sealed your fate by creating a commitment and alliance with the devil himself. And we start talking about these things, and we, I think, are living in a generation where we have that responsibility to tell people, the Jewish temple is going to be rebuilt. There's going to be a man who comes along and solves the Middle East crisis. There's going to be a war where a series of nations, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Libya, Sudan, all invade Israel, and they're going to die through supernatural means and lay dead on the mountains of Israel. And when they see this, they're going to remember our words. But we cannot stop there. We have to give the rest of the story as to why we have this information. Because if the Bible is 100% accurate in its prophetic elements, that means that spiritual truths are 100% accurate as well. And that means that Jesus claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life, and the only access to the Father is also true. And we need to tell them, you must be born again. Now, the Times of Israel reports that 65 Berlin police injured as pro-Palestinian protesters call to burn everything. So we have multiple countries telling their citizens to be careful out there on the world scene. And now here we have evidence of why that was necessary. 65 police officers were injured at an overnight protest in Berlin against Israel's response against Hamas in the Gaza Strip after the terror group launched a devastating attack earlier this month that killed over 1,400, authorities said on Thursday. As demonstrators defied bans on such gatherings, the officers were wounded by stones, flammable liquid, and acts of resistance, Berlin police said on social media platforms. And a police spokeswoman said 174 people were arrested, including 65 who will be facing investigations, inciting terror and things of that nature. The gathering began late Wednesday in a district with a large Arab community, and the Bild Daily and a call had gone out on Telegram calling on men to turn Nukolin, the city where this began, into Gaza, burn everything. As police ordered protesters to disperse, rubbish bins and obstacles were put on the streets, and stones and pyrotechnics were thrown at them, prompting police to respond by firing water cannon, said authorities. It's interesting to see this happening in Europe, and you pair that with the warning that the U.S. State Department just issued. There was, an implied call for us here in the homeland to pay attention as well, because there's a large population of people who support Hamas and the Palestinians as well here in the good old U.S. of A. So we need to have our radar up. Now, the Al Jumina reports, listen to this: anti-Semitic Americans more likely to support political violence than the rest of the population, according to a study. Anti-Semitic Americans are more likely to support violence to achieve their political goals, as well as anti-democratic and conspiratorial beliefs compared to the general population, according to a new survey. The Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, and the University of Chicago's Project on Security and Threats, or CPOST, on Thursday released a survey titled Anti-Semitism and Support for Political Violence, which found a strong correlation between anti-Semitism, support for political violence, and anti-democratic conspiracy theories on both ends of the political spectrum. The survey was unveiled amid a global surge in anti-Semitic incidents following the Palestinian terror group Hamas' ongoing terror onslaught against Israel, with numerous demonstrations erupting of activists defending Hamas and denouncing not only the Jewish state, but also the Jewish community. And Americans on the political right who accept anti-Jewish tropes are 3 times more likely than the general population to approve of violence to restore Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency. And again, there's the whole point of this particular article. Now, the survey of 8,000 Americans conducted earlier this year showed that 33% of anti-Semites would support partitioning the country between red Republican and blue Democratic states, compared to 16% for the rest of the country. Well, the truth is that the far right is not anti-Semitic. It's the left that's anti-Semitic. And what we have to realize is that anti-Semitism is satanic, and it is birthed out of a demonic spirit that is going to sweep the globe and cause the world to be polarized into 2 groups, Israel and the rest of the world. And so, again, the efforts to, blame the right for what's going on in our country when the left is actually the ones who are anti-Semitic just proves again that we are living in an age of delusion, and Jesus is coming soon. Now, World Israel News reports that an escalating terror risk in Turkey, Israelis are told to leave the country immediately. Israel's National Security Council, which issues travel warnings for foreign countries, ordered Israeli tourists who are currently in Turkey to leave the country immediately. And public sentiment against Israel in Arab and Islamic countries has soured against the backdrop of the ongoing Swords of Iron war. Now, on Wednesday, Turkey's warning level for Israeli tourists was raised to level 4, the highest possible designation. And Israeli authorities urged citizens in the country to return to Israel as quickly as possible. The NSC also raised the warning level to 2 regarding travel in Morocco. And according to our assessments, there are hundreds of Israelis in Turkey. The threat is very specific, which is why we raised it to level 4 and urge those who are there to leave, to take extreme precautions while they remain there, a senior intelligence official told the Hebrew language outlet Ynet. We've already seen the accuracy and authenticity of threats in Turkey last year. If Israelis heed the instructions, we can manage this situation. And the official stated that Israelis who are currently abroad should remain a low profile and not flaunt their country of origin. It's not advisable to openly identify as an Israeli abroad right now, the official stressed. Back in 2012, I was in Israel, and our tour guide, I was in Turkey, I should say, a wonderful guide, just incredibly knowledgeable about the history of the area. And as we were touring much of Turkey, Istanbul, and Smyrna, and certainly Ephesus and other ancient Christian sites, he pointed out as we were driving down the streets of Istanbul, two women walking in full burqas. And he paused and drew our attention to this and said, "You never used to see that here." He said, "There's change in the wind." And again, this is back in 2012. And now under Tayyip Erdogan, we're seeing the radicalization of a country and a place where Israelis used to vacation by the tens of thousands in Turkey, and the beautiful boardwalk that's there, and just all the shops and everything. And now they're being warned to get out of there for their own safety. And the tide is certainly changing and has been changing in Turkey. And now you've got a place that is joining the ranks of being gathered against Jerusalem. And the Gateway pundit says, and we'll branch out here a little bit beyond Israel. The Gateway pundit says Biden's border security takes aim at Christians. And the Biden administration claims that America's southern border is closed, even as its policies allow millions of illegal aliens to flood in, has become one of the greatest misleading statements. But there's one segment of society that is feeling the full brunt of border security, and that is persecuted Christians. A report at Decision magazine documents that the U.S., with Joe Biden now in the White House, has cut cut the resettlement of Christians fleeing persecution around the globe by 70% compared to 2016. Open Doors, which annually ranks the 50 countries in which it is most difficult to live as Christians, and World Relief, a global Christian humanitarian organization, issued a joint report in September that in 2022, the U.S. government resettled barely 1/3 of the number of Christian refugees who were granted asylum in 2016. In fact, in 2022, Christians resettled from the most threatening 50 nations for Christian persecution was down 70% from 6 years earlier. The actual numbers of Christians resettled was 9,528, down from 32,248 in 2016. And the Biden administration did adjust the resettlement limit upward later, but the U.S. still failed to even reach the initial ceiling of 15,000 by the end of the year. And the report also reveals this year Biden's Department of Homeland Security adopted a new rule that mostly restricts eligibility for asylum for those who enter the U.S. other than at a lawful port of entry. And Biden's new process for requesting asylum appointments at ports of entry doesn't have openings enough for those who are requesting that status. And today, most Christians in the U.S. recognize the great blessing it is to live in the country with strong protections for religious liberty, where, though in some settings we may be mocked or disliked, very few of us live in fear of losing our lives or being forced to flee our homes because of our faith in Jesus, said Matt Sorens of World Relief. So the tide is changing. And I think, we have to remember that, Jesus said we would be hated for his name's sake. And, we've watched Judeo-Christian values that made this country great crumble and be cast aside, and they're now viewed as archaic and antiquated and even backward thinking. And that's why we have the ChatGPT versions of the Bible and made up quotations of Jesus, affirming many of the sexual behaviors that the Bible says are prohibited. And again, we're in the last days. Everything is happening. The Lord's coming for us soon. So let's be out there about the Father's business, which is telling people about his Son. Now, the Military Times says Putin touts solidarity with China in Xi's pitch for a new world order, Xi Jinping, that is, for a new world order as crisis grips the Middle East. Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping discussed the conflict in the Middle East during a meeting on the sidelines of the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing on Wednesday, according to the Russian leader, who said common threats brought the two countries closer. The international gathering, which saw leaders and representatives from countries mostly in the global south congregate in the Chinese capital, and took place under the shadow of war between Israel and the militant group Hamas, and threatens to escalate into broader regional conflict. And we discussed in detail the situation in the Middle East, Putin said in the press conference, and I informed Chairman Xi about the situation that is developing on the Ukrainian track, also quite in detail. All these external factors are common threats, and they strengthen Russian-Chinese interaction, Putin added. And a readout published by Chinese state media said Xi had conducted an in-depth exchange of views on the situation of Israel and the Palestinians with his Russian counterpart, but did not provide any further details of what was discussed. Now, the question often comes up, what about China? What about China in the last days scenario? And, the answer is always the same, that the Bible doesn't name China, but the Bible doesn't name a lot of other nations in the last days scenario, but it does name Russia. And you have to wonder about the attitude of the world when God destroys these invading armies and leaves them dead on the mountains of Israel, as we talked about a few moments ago. But again, recognizing what's happening in the world tells us of the lateness of the hour. And I don't know what role China is going to have in the world scene in the last days. And there's nothing really specific in Scripture about them. But this is an interesting pairing, because one thing we do know is that China and Russia are bent on the destruction of Western culture. And their desire is for the U.S. to no longer dominate on the global scene, to move the world away from U.S. petrodollars and have each country exchange their money for oil in their own currencies, rather than using the U.S. currency as the monies in which oil is purchased. So, again, this move and these two groups, significant power players out there in the world, we can't ignore the fact that they are coming closer and closer together. And yet, at the same time, I think we need to remember that God is in control. And I don't know what's going to happen to the United States, and I don't think anybody else can say definitively. But my prayer is, my hope is that the reason the U.S. is not mentioned in Bible prophecy is because the rapture clears us out from sea to shining sea, and there's nothing but skeleton left, a skeleton of people left behind, because you and I got out there and told people about Jesus, and there was a final great awakening in our country. Now, one last story, and I had to include this. We've talked about comets a lot before, but I had to read this from the New York Post. Multiple outlets are reporting this, but from the New York Post, simply because of one statement that's at the end of this article. And the New York Post writes, a devil comet 3 times the size of Mount Everest makes way to Earth. Now, of course, that's sensationalizing what's actually happening. But a comet 3 times the size of Mount Everest is heading toward the Earth, according to astronomers. Penn's Brooks, which has been deemed as the devil comet due to its horns, exploded on October 5th and is now on a trajectory towards Earth. Yet there's no need to worry, however, because the comet is not expected to hit the Earth, but will be visible to some parts of the Earth between April and June of next year. Pons, not Penn's. Pons Brooks is a dry volcanic comet, which means it's basically a cold volcano that constantly releases icy debris throughout the solar system. And remember, I believe that the star wormwood, a heavenly body wormwood, is actually a comet, because comets, as we just read, are largely comprised of ice, radioactive ice at that. So if a large comet enters into our solar system and begins to break up when it hits the Earth's atmosphere and covers the world in radioactive rain, it would poison a third of the world's water supply, like we know that freshwater supply, as we know that the star wormwood does. Now, the article says, if things didn't seem apocalyptic enough already, scientists reported that a horned comet 3 times bigger than Mount Everest exploded and is hurtling toward Earth. And the blast originated on October 5th from 12P Pons Brooks, a cryovolcanic or cold volcano comet that measures a colossal 18.6 miles in diameter, or the size of a small city, according to Live Science. For references, Mount Everest, the highest mountain on the Earth, is 29,029 feet high, or about 5.5 miles. This marked the second time this interstellar ice cube erupted in the last 4 months, with the last celestial event occurring in July, the Science Times reported. Now, listen close. Astronomers believe the closest the comet will reach towards the Earth is 144 million miles, so there's no need to worry. And here's what caught my eye for now. There's no need to worry for now. Now, I don't know what it is that they're seeing out there, and I don't know, here we've got all of a sudden these stories about these exploding comets, losing a portion of their tail, the sun spewing out a coronal mass ejection and tore the tail off a comet just a couple of months ago. And now we've got these exploding comets. And, when something explodes, you can't calculate the trajectory. And so I think that's why this statement at the end, there's no need to worry for now. And I just think this is a pretty amazing story, considering the fact that, as I said, I believe clearly that the content that we have in the book of Revelation, when you've got something that enters the atmosphere from space and poisons a third of the world's drinking water, that has all the markings of a comet, gas and ice, breaking up and distributing itself over a third of the earth, poisoning the water supply, causing many people to die, according to Revelation. Now, again, just watching all these things happen, seeing the things that we used to read about and wonder about now forming right in front of us, or beginning to be fulfilled, so to speak, right in front of us, should give us a sense of urgency and desperation for the people around us who are perishing. And I can't say that often enough, that we just need to be about what God has called us to do. Go to the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And, preaching judgment is very effective. And we see that as true with Jonah. And we see in the midst of the tribulation period. And by the way, when we're told by Jesus that the gospel will be preached to the whole world, and then the end will come, that's talking about the angel flying in the mid-heaven of the sky during the tribulation, preaching the everlasting gospel to the world. And the everlasting gospel, according to the book of Revelation and the preaching of this angel, says, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. And so we need to be talking about these things out there. And people right now are afraid. And, we've got things happening in our own country that have never happened in our country before. We've got growing violence. And listen, all anti-Semitism is demonic in its origin, whether that be spiritual anti-Semitism or the skinhead type anti-Semitism. It's all from the devil, and it's rising, and it's going to become global in scope. And then now we're seeing violence manifesting itself in places all over the world. And we need to keep these things in mind and not be afraid, and be bold in our faith. And just remember, as we go out to do what God has called us to do, that he is going to be with us in our efforts to bring his name glory and to preach Christ and him crucified. So let's be bold for the Lord in these last days. Let's remember, people I've heard groups that were kind of soft on their position say, well, they don't want to choose sides in the Hamas-Israeli conflict. Well, yeah, you do. You want to choose the side of right. And, of course, the consequences of war are tragic, and the loss of life is tragic as well. But, this has been the life of the Israelis for the whole of their 75 years. They've been under constant attack, brief periods of peace. But how many times have we seen rockets fired from Gaza into Israel? And much to no avail, but they're still fired, and you still have to run for your life. The siren still sounds. You still have just 1 minute to get to cover. And what a way to live. And, to say, well, Israel's response is disproportionate and we have to maintain proportionality is just foolishness. And God brought them back into the land. God brought them back because he did this for his holy name's sake. If you want to read it yourself, go to Ezekiel chapter 36 and start with verse 20 and continue reading. And you'll see why they're back in the land. You'll see why God brought the dry bones back to life, and the whole progression that's recorded there. So again, thank you all for joining us. That's all we have for tonight, and appreciate your prayers and support, and looking forward to being back at the church this Sunday, starting the book of 2 Timothy. If you want to watch online, you can go to cctustin.org. And I'll remind you, we did change the church name because we had to move, and it is now Calvary Central OC, OC standing for Orange County, California, that is. And but we haven't switched over the website yet because that's quite a task to move a website. So anyway, cctustin.org if you'd like to join us, 9 and 11 a.m. Pacific time. You can catch it later on YouTube. Well, again, that's all we have for this week. And let's be praying for the peace of Jerusalem like we're instructed to do in the scripture, and pray most of all that this time of stress and strain and trauma on the Israeli people would cause them to look to the true Prince of Peace, the Messiah, the Holy One of Israel, the Mashiach ben David, the Son of David, the root and offspring of David, many titles pointing to Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God, and they would call on his great name. Well, again, appreciate you joining us, and hey, give this a share, and let's get the word out as to what's really going on in this world, and offer people hope in the midst of all this trouble we see. Well, you know what comes next. We'll see you here, there, or in the air. God bless you.